Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The day Ella Madden was born, the sky was calm and quiet, but within her tiny body was a storm no one saw coming. Doctors noted the twist in her lower spine and the uneven pull of her tendons with detached concern, writing it down in folders and murmuring complicated terms to one another. Her mother cried. Her father asked if she would ever walk. The answer was yes, but not like other children. Ella would never glide. She would never run freely. Her gait would always leap to one side, as though her legs argued about which direction to follow. The limp wasn't painful, not physically, but it carried the weight of every eye that would later turn to look, of every whisper that would follow her down school corridors like stubborn shadows. She learned early that people didn't just see how you walked, they judged what it meant, and in a town like Greystone, different was a loaded word. Kids laughed. Teachers, though polite, often hurried past her, not cruel but uncomfortable. And by the time she reached third grade, she had mastered the art of disappearing, sitting near the back, not raising her hand, keeping her eyes down, even though her mind was sharper than most. The world didn't expect brilliance from someone who didn't move in a straight line. So she kept it hidden, folded up inside her like an unused letter. While others chased soccer balls and danced at recitals, Ella lived in books. There, she didn't have to explain why her body moved the way it did. Paper didn't laugh. Stories didn't point. There were days she told herself she didn't care, that the jokes and stares didn't matter. But she did care, and it did matter. High school was worse. The cruelty had matured. Fewer laughs, more smirks. The nicknames became quieter but sharper. They started calling her Twitch, or sometimes just Bounce. One boy once said, "She walks like she's dodging ghosts." He said it to make his friends laugh, but Ella carried it home like a wound. Her mother told her to ignore them, to hold her head high, but Ella had long discovered that dignity offered little armor against ridicule. The classrooms were cages, and the hallways were minefields. At lunch, she sat alone, not because she wanted to, but because she knew the sting of rejection before it even arrived. She tried once, just once, to sit with a group of girls from her English class. They smiled politely, shifted in their seats, then quietly rose one by one until she was the only one left at the table. After that, she stopped trying. She created a routine: arrive early, leave late, avoid eye contact, never hope for kindness. The days bled into each other. She grew quieter, not out of shyness, but out of self-preservation. People noticed her silence more than they ever noticed her words. It was as though her limp gave them permission to look at her differently, to expect less. Her world narrowed into a tunnel, one step at a time. When college came, Ella hoped the world would be different. New campus, new faces, new start. She arrived at Greystone College with more books than clothes, her heart stitched together by thin strands of quiet optimism. But hope is a fragile thing, and reality tore through it like a blade. The stares came back, subtler this time, older, more careful, but present. Students didn't laugh out loud anymore. They exchanged looks. They offered her help she didn't ask for, spoke slowly as though she was broken in more than one way. In a sea of youth desperate to prove themselves, Ella stuck out like a misplaced puzzle piece. Her professors appreciated her writing, but their praise always carried a tone of surprise, like they hadn't expected someone who walked like her to have thoughts so sharp. Once, a classmate she was paired with for a research paper asked if she would mind just editing while he wrote. She smiled, nodded, then quietly rewrote the entire paper the night before it was due. They received an A, and he never thanked her. No one ever did. She wasn't bitter, only tired. Tired of being underestimated. Tired of pretending it didn't sting. Tired of dragging her heart behind her like a second limp. The campus was larger. the faces more diverse, but the world hadn't changed. It just wore a nicer coat. And then, just when the silence had begun to settle in like furniture in a room she hadn't chosen, she met Alex Carter. He wasn't loud or overly charming. He didn't make a grand entrance or float around on the confidence of a well-loved athlete. He simply spoke to her, not at her, not through her, but to her like she was a real person with real thoughts and no need for pity. The first time they spoke, it was in the campus library. He asked if she had a pen. She offered him one, then returned to her book, expecting the interaction to end there. But it didn't. The next time, he sat across from her, then beside her. Then one day, without asking, he walked beside her between classes, matching her pace, not out of charity, but because it felt natural to him. She waited for the awkward moment, the joke, the question. It never came. With Alex, there were no strange pauses, no second glances at her legs. He asked about her thoughts on books, not her body. He laughed at her dry sarcasm and once called her wickedly brilliant. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had seen her pass the way she walked. But Alex did. And that, for Ella, was the first time she truly felt seen, not watched, not studied, but understood. It was dangerous, but it was real. Word travels on college campuses the way fire crawls through dry grass, fast, loud, and with no mercy for the things it consumes. As the weeks rolled on, Ella's quiet friendship with Alex drew attention, not because they were loud or affectionate, but because they weren't supposed to make sense. That was how people saw it. She had grown used to the isolation, and now someone normal, someone admired, was choosing to be seen with her in broad daylight. It disrupted their understanding of the world. Girls noticed first. The ones who had always tossed their hair a little too hard around Alex, the ones who measured worth in glances and comments, narrowed their eyes. The boys followed soon after. They mocked her when Alex wasn't around, made jokes that weren't even clever, just cruel. Must be a charity project, one said in the cafeteria, loud enough for her to hear. She kept eating, chewing slowly, swallowing harder. But the words sat heavy in her chest like a stone too jagged to ignore. Sometimes she wondered if Alex noticed, if he caught the shifts in tone, the glances that didn't quite hide their venom. But if he did, he never said. He just kept showing up, sat beside her in lectures, saved her a seat in crowded rooms, walked beside her through the quad like the world didn't hum with judgment. That stubborn kindness of his wasn't loud, but it was defiant. And in that defiance, she found something she never had before, space to exist without apology. Still, the pressure grew, invisible but undeniable, like a storm building out of sight. They called it a misunderstanding at first, but the tone and the whispers made it clear no one believed that. The story broke on a Thursday afternoon, when the air was heavy and strange and students buzzed around the dorms like bees sensing a shift. There had been a party the night before, a house off campus, music, drinks, bodies packed too tightly in rooms that smelled like sweat and artificial fruit punch. Ella hadn't gone. She never did. Crowds made her uncomfortable, and stares were a nightmare. She was in her dorm, reading, when the message came in. Just a short text from a girl in her ethics class. Is it true about your friend? No punctuation, no words. Just those words. By morning, the whispers had matured into stories, each version messier than the last. Alex had cornered a girl. She cried. Someone heard it. Or maybe it happened in the basement. Or maybe not at all. But by noon, one thing was certain. The girl's name was Kayla Hartley, a sophomore majoring in public relations, blonde, confident, and popular enough that people paid attention when she spoke. And she had spoken. Loudly. Tearfully. Convincingly. Ella didn't see Alex that day. She waited outside his dorm, called his phone, walked through the common areas, trying not to limp too fast. Nothing. Then came the sirens. The patrol car wasn't loud, but the presence was seismic. Campus security flanked the police as they stepped into the dorm building. And then, minutes later, he emerged. Not fighting, not yelling, just walking, hands cuffed behind his back, eyes searching the crowd. They locked eyes for a second. Just a second. But in that sliver of time, Ella felt something in her unravel. He didn't look afraid. He looked betrayed. No one came to her for a statement, though they all seemed to think she had one to give. The silence was not kind. It was suffocating. People passed her with quiet disgust, as if the stench of what Alex had been accused of now clung to her skin. They no longer said things out loud, but their distance screamed it for them. In the lecture halls, chairs stayed empty beside her. In the dining area, conversations paused when she entered, then resumed with eyes that burned into her back. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat like sharp glass. She wasn't sure what hurt more, that they believed it or that they were so quick to. In the following days, flyers appeared on bulletin boards about safety and consent. A campus forum was organized. Ella sat in the back, listening as people nodded and clapped about accountability, none of them knowing the boy they were crucifying had once walked her home in the rain, because the gravel paths were slippery. Kayla never spoke at the forum, but her absence spoke volumes. She didn't have to be there. Her story had already taken root. It didn't matter that Ella knew Alex wasn't that kind of person. It didn't matter that the timeline didn't make sense, or that the house had poor lighting, or that the girl telling the story had always looked at Alex like something she wanted but couldn't reach. What mattered was that the crowd had chosen a villain, and they had already sentenced him long before the courtroom. Ella stayed up for nights after his arrest, cycling through memory after memory. The way he never touched her without asking. The time he held the door open while her arms were full of books and said nothing, just waited. The day he noticed her limping harder than usual and slowed his pace without comment. These were not the actions of a predator. These were the markers of someone gentle, someone good. And yet he was gone. The dorm room across from hers sat dark and empty, and with it her sense of safety. For the first time in months, she felt the return of that old feeling, that loneliness so familiar it almost comforted her. But now it was worse, because now she had tasted connection, however brief, and it had been ripped away. People asked fewer questions as days passed. The campus moved on, as it always does. Exams returned, parties resumed, but Ella could not move. She walked the same paths, sat in the same seats, but everything was altered. Alex's absence lived in every corner, every silence. And no one, no professor, no student, no friend, offered her even a thread of kindness. She carried the weight of her body and the weight of that silence alone. And though she still moved forward, it no longer felt like walking. It felt like dragging everything she had left behind her, one step at a time. The days after Alex's arrest bled together like ink soaking through damp paper, indistinct, colorless, and without any clear edge. Ella drifted through them like someone sleepwalking in her own life, unable to wake or escape. Her limbs moved out of habit, not purpose. She still went to classes, still submitted her assignments, still answered roll calls in a voice so low it barely rose above a whisper, but inside she was hollow. The laughter she once ignored now rang louder, crueler. The stairs she once climbed with grit now felt like punishment. No one said his name anymore, not aloud. It was as if the college had scrubbed him from its memory. Flyers about assault remained on corkboards, but there were no updates. No clarifications. Patience. Fardes. Rules de seus docentes. En kwesties of documentations, estefte de valkant, fitosens. Spines. Mione no biveel. Salti moment in ostos, it is businesses. Do I feel so befas? Or not vacations. Obligations, voorslussels. En fosses of suggestions, neofications. No justice. People moved on like they always do, their conversations returning to weekend plans and exam anxiety. But for Ella, time had split. There was before Alex's arrest, and there was after, and everything in the after felt colder. She stopped eating in the cafeteria, started carrying her food in paper bags, eating outside alone, even in the chill. Her favorite bench under the old campus maple became her refuge. The bark beside her bore the faint scratch marks of initials long faded, and though she couldn't name a single couple they belonged to, she envied the permanence of their memory. Hers was vanishing. One afternoon, she found herself holding the pen Alex once borrowed. It was cracked now, barely usable. But she kept it in her pocket anyway, a ridiculous totem of a friendship no one believed had ever mattered. When the semester ended, Ella went home, but it didn't feel like home anymore. The small, creaky house on Birch Lane still smelled like lavender and tea, and her mother still tried to treat her like she hadn't been broken apart by something too large to name. But Ella barely spoke. The television stayed on in the living room, playing courtroom dramas and holiday commercials, but she stayed in her room, curtains drawn, lights dim. She opened her laptop late at night and searched for news about the case. Nothing. No court documents, no trial dates, no official statements, as if the arrest had been an illusion. She called once, just once, to the police station that handled the case, pretending to be a student journalist. The woman on the phone asked for her name, and Ella hung up before she answered. The walls of her room, once covered with motivational posters and sticky notes from late-night study sessions, now looked bare and sterile. The books on her shelves went unread. And the sound of her own footsteps, each uneven, each tapping out a rhythm the world never got used to, felt louder than ever before. Her mother eventually stopped knocking, stopped asking. It was easier that way. Some nights, Ella would lie in bed and imagine what Alex's cell might look like. Did it have a window? Could he see the moon? She pictured him sitting on a metal bed frame, staring at the floor, counting cracks. In her mind, he never cried, but she did. Returning to campus the next semester was like walking back into a fire you'd barely escaped from. Nothing had changed outwardly. The building still stood, ivy still curled around the stair railings, and students still lounged on the grass like nothing had ever happened. But to Ella, everything was different. The faces she once ignored now stared longer. Some were blank, others curious, and a few brimmed with a quiet kind of accusation. One professor welcomed her back with a too-tight smile, her voice stretched thin with discomfort. "Glad to see you're still with us," she said, as if Ella had disappeared, or worse, as if she should have. No one brought up Alex, but she saw it in the way they treated her, the careful pauses in conversation, the slight shifts in posture when she approached. She felt like she was living under a microscope, observed but never acknowledged, known but never spoken to. Still, she pressed on. She sat in the front row of every class, took meticulous notes, answered questions. Her grades rose with every passing week, even as her spirit withered. It wasn't pride that kept her going, it was fury. Not the kind that flared up and vanished, but a slow, smoldering anger that hardened into resolve. If no one would believe her truth, then she would make herself undeniable. If the world wanted to define her by what it thought she was, she'd become something so sharp it couldn't be ignored. The library became her sanctuary again, not because she needed escape, but because knowledge became her armor. Law wasn't always her path, not originally. She had entered college with a plan to study literature, to maybe become a writer or an editor, to work quietly behind words rather than stand in front of them. But everything changed the day Alex was taken. She realized then that stories weren't enough, that the world didn't change through poetry or essays, not always. It changed through confrontation, through standing up and making the system see what it had tried to bury. She switched majors before the end of her second year. It was a quiet switch, no announcement, no ceremony. But the day she held her first law textbook, something shifted inside her. The language of justice was foreign at first, dry, clinical, filled with clauses and precedents that stretched longer than her patience, but she absorbed it, not because it was beautiful, but because it was powerful. She began to attend legal aid forums, volunteer in student justice groups, ask questions that made even her professors pause. Her limp never disappeared, but now it moved with purpose. Every uneven step reminded her of what she had lost, what she had watched happen, what she was going to fight to prevent. She started staying up later, poring over court cases by the dim light of her desk lamp. In the margins, she wrote notes in fine, hard script, questions, rebuttals, challenges. The same fire that once made her cry now burned in her fingers, and when classmates passed her in the hallway, they no longer whispered jokes. They stepped aside, not out of kindness, but out of caution. She was no longer the girl with the strange walk. She was something else entirely, and she had just begun. The years following Ella's graduation were not marked by celebration, but by relentless movement. She poured herself into the grind of internships, bar prep, and night classes, each day folding into the next with the predictability of a machine. While others from her cohort vacationed or celebrated engagements, she worked. In her cramped one-room apartment in Windrow City, she studied under flickering lights, often eating cold meals between case reviews and legal aid meetings. She was young, but she carried herself like someone who had already seen the end of things, someone who had known loss too early to believe in comfort. Her reputation grew quietly. Clients who had nowhere else to go spoke her name like a prayer passed between hands. She never sought the spotlight, yet somehow it found her. Local publications began to notice the young woman with the uneven walk and the razor-sharp mind who fought like a cornered lion for the underrepresented. She never brought up her past. She let her work speak instead, using every closing argument to slice into systems that once swallowed a boy she once knew. But in quiet moments, long after the courtrooms emptied and the doors of her office clicked shut, she would sometimes wonder where he was. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself the past was a stone better left untouched. But some memories don't stay buried. They pulse beneath the surface like bruises that refuse to fade. It was a Wednesday afternoon, hot and dust-heavy, when she entered the Graybrook Correctional Center to meet her latest client. The man was accused of robbery with a weapon he never owned and an alibi no one cared to verify. Another case buried beneath lazy paperwork and the convenience of silence. She wore a navy suit, her badge clipped to her blouse, and her briefcase full of carefully labeled files. The guards at the gate barely looked up when she passed. They'd seen her before. She had earned her place among the voices that didn't waver. She had expected the usual routine, 10 minutes waiting in the lobby, 15 in a stale visitation room with flickering lights and sticky floors, then an hour building a case out of broken truths. But what she didn't expect, what struck her like a ghost wearing familiar skin, was the name the officer mumbled as she handed over the visitor log. Carter, Alex. Bay 6. Her heart stuttered. She stared at the clipboard as if reading it wrong might rewrite it. But the letters stayed where they were. She hadn't heard that name spoken in years, hadn't seen it typed, hadn't dared to Google it. Something inside her told her to turn around, to leave, to pretend this moment didn't exist. But her feet didn't listen. Her steps, always careful, always calculated, moved forward on their own, driven not by curiosity, but by something deeper, something unresolved. She didn't allow herself to hope. She only allowed herself to see. And when she did, when the glass door buzzed open and she stepped into the visitation bay, he was already there. Older, leaner, wearing an orange uniform and a face that still held the shape of the boy she once knew. His eyes lifted slowly, and when they met hers, neither of them spoke, because in that breathless second, words felt too small. They sat across from each other, separated by a scratched-up glass wall and a telephone that smelled faintly of sweat and bleach. She picked up the receiver with fingers that didn't shake, but felt numb. He did the same, more hesitant, as if expecting it to shatter in his hand. Up close, he looked like someone time had chewed on. His jaw was harder, his cheeks slightly sunken, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. But the moment he spoke, she heard it, the echo of the old voice, the one that once joked softly between classes and asked about her favorite novels without ever pitying her. "Ella," he said, like he was remembering the shape of her name for the first time. She didn't answer right away. She just looked. He told her he hadn't meant to see her again, not like this, that the years had blurred, that he'd stopped counting after the fifth, that he never even had a trial. Just a plea deal made under pressure, stacked charges he never understood, and a lawyer who said take it or lose everything. She listened without interrupting, her mind already racing through the holes in his story, the procedural gaps, the inconsistencies that smelled like rot. He told her Kayla had moved states before dying in a boating accident, news he'd received 2 years after her death. That no one ever told him officially. He just heard from another inmate whose cousin had read it in a newspaper. He told her about the added charges, things he never remembered being accused of. She scribbled notes without looking down, because she already knew what she would do. In the weeks that followed, Ella returned more times than she could count. She didn't announce it. She didn't even tell her secretary the full truth. She just filed the paperwork, pulled every record she could find, and began to unravel the web, one document at a time. What she found made her skin crawl. The arrest report was incomplete. The evidence log had items listed that were never recovered, and most damning of all, there was a clerk's signature on an amended charge list that bore the wrong date. She tracked down that clerk, now retired, living in a dusty apartment above a pawn shop in the next county. He confessed in a voice like crumbling sand. He had been told to modify Alex's file under pressure from someone high up. It wasn't hard to guess who. Ella dug deeper, reached out to a paralegal who once worked under the district attorney during Kayla's case. The woman, reluctant at first, eventually admitted what Ella feared. Kayla's father had pushed for a swift case, said the boy was a threat, told everyone to shut it down quietly. Ella compiled the statements, built a timeline, documented the errors, the forgery, the lies, and the omissions. And through it all, Alex watched silently from across the table, slowly believing, perhaps for the first time in years, that someone still thought he mattered. On the day she filed the motion to reopen the case, she didn't wear makeup. Her hair was tied back. Her suit was simple. But her voice, when she spoke in the courtroom, was thunder. Not loud, but final. Not angry, but immovable. The judge watched her with the kind of attention reserved for witnesses of storms, and when the motion was approved, she didn't smile. She only looked back at Alex, and he looked at her the way a man drowning looks at land. The reopening of Alex's case stirred the dust from long-forgotten corners of the courthouse, and with it came the kind of silence that buzzed with discomfort. Some of the clerks whispered when Ella passed, others looked away, pretending not to see the young woman with the limp who walked as if the weight of injustice didn't slow her down. But it did, and she just refused to show it. The motion had only been the beginning. What followed was an uphill climb through years of paper trails, riddled with contradictions and names that didn't match the records they were supposed to represent. She requested internal memos, court transcripts, old testimonies, some of which had mysteriously vanished or returned edited beyond recognition. Her motions for information were delayed again and again, excuses stacking like bricks. She countered each one with precise citations, her arguments filed with sharp language that made even the laziest judges pause. In one document, a fingerprint card had been switched out and refiled under a different date. The signature on it, dated 2 months after Alex's conviction, was proof that someone had been working behind the scenes to secure his silence. Each new piece of evidence unfolded like a rotted curtain, revealing a stage dressed in lies. She worked from her apartment floor, case files spread around her like puzzle pieces, her body sore from hours hunched in concentration. Coffee replaced meals, and sleep came only in short bursts. She didn't stop. Couldn't. Because with every line she read, she saw not only Alex's stolen years, but the face of her own silence all those years ago, staring back at her. She requested access to Kayla's original witness statement, a transcript that had become the holy grail of the prosecution's case. It was supposed to be sealed due to her death, but Ella had already found the legal clause that allowed review under circumstances of perjury or obstruction. The judge resisted at first, citing the sensitivity of posthumous victim records, but Ella argued with the kind of quiet ferocity that didn't waver under pressure. She read from the policy handbook line by line, and when that wasn't enough, she filed a separate motion for a post-conviction review. It was granted, barely, and when she finally received the transcript, she sat alone in her office, the lights dimmed, the door locked. Reading the words, she didn't know what she expected. What she found wasn't some confession or smoking gun, but a testimony that contradicted multiple other accounts from the night of the party. Kayla had placed Alex in the basement of a house that didn't have one. Her timeline overlapped with security footage Ella had pulled from the street camera outside the building. Alex had left the party an hour before the incident supposedly occurred. There were no witnesses mentioned in the statement, though in early documents, 2 students claimed they had seen Kayla crying outside. Those students had since transferred out of state. She tracked one down, a girl named Simone, now working in an antique bookstore in Vermont. Over a scratchy video call, Simone admitted that Kayla had asked her to back up the story and that she hadn't even been at the party until after it ended. She cried while telling Ella, apologizing between every sentence. She said Kayla had been angry, said Alex made her feel invisible. Ella thanked her, then ended the call. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat in silence, the guilt she had carried for years morphing into a bitter kind of clarity. Ella presented everything to the appeals board with the patience of someone who had been silenced too many times to waste a single word. She laid it all out, the altered reports, the lost footage, the corrupted fingerprints, the testimony that no longer held up under scrutiny, and the added charges filed post-sentencing. Each document was numbered, tabbed, and cross-referenced. The courtroom didn't gasp. There were no dramatic outbursts or stunned silences. This wasn't a movie, it was reality, and in reality, justice groaned like rusted machinery before it ever moved. The state's attorneys tried to stall, to question her credibility, to delay the inevitable, but even they began to see the foundation beneath them cracking. When Ella subpoenaed the former clerk who had admitted to falsifying documents, he appeared in court with trembling hands and a faded suit. Under oath, he confirmed it all, said he was following orders, said he didn't think the boy would actually serve more than a year, said he didn't know the DA would make it permanent. That admission opened the door. More names followed. More pieces fit together. The room grew thick with discomfort. No one wanted to say it, but the truth had already carved itself into the record. Alex had been buried by a machine that had no brakes. After the hearing adjourned, Ella stood in the hallway, shoulders tight, fingers shaking only when she was alone. The board's decision would come in days. Alex had watched the whole thing from behind a thick pane of security glass. He hadn't said anything when they made eye contact. He just looked at her with a stillness that said more than relief. It was the look of a man who had held his breath for nearly a decade and finally dared to exhale. The official reversal came in a letter she received on a Tuesday morning. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a crisp envelope slipped beneath her door. The ruling was unanimous. Alex's conviction was vacated. The charges dismissed. The record sealed. The prison doors opened 2 weeks later, and she was there when he stepped out, clothes too loose, eyes blinking against the sunlight like it was something foreign. He didn't speak right away. Neither did she. They just stood there, 2 survivors of something unspeakable, facing the morning with no script to follow. He walked slowly beside her, not because she needed him to match her pace, but because he needed to relearn the rhythm of freedom. The settlement came after. A check signed by a state that couldn't look him in the eye. It didn't fix anything, but it acknowledged something the world had long refused to admit, that he had been stolen. That his life had been taken by ink and gavel and made into an example of silence. Ella didn't attend the press conference. She let his lawyer handle the media. What mattered had already been said, in courtrooms, in paper trails, in the long, sleepless nights neither of them would speak of again. They walked home that day in silence. Not the silence of distance, but of understanding. The road back wasn't paved, and the past wouldn't be erased, but it no longer held them hostage. And when she opened her apartment door and he followed her inside, there was no need to explain anything. Some truths live in footsteps, not words. The weeks after Alex's release passed with the quiet awkwardness of two people learning how to exist in a world that no longer resembled the one they had lost each other in. There was no celebration, no wild laughter, no relief that washed everything clean. Instead, there were long silences interrupted by soft sounds, the hum of a kettle, the creak of an old floorboard, the thud of books being stacked on a shelf. He stayed with her, not because they planned it, but because it felt like the only option that made sense. At first, he slept on her couch, using one of her old quilts and a pillow that barely supported his neck. She offered him the bed. He refused. It wasn't pride, it was habit. In prison, comfort was a distant concept, and habits were formed in the tight space between survival and surrender. Ella didn't push. She went to work every morning, returning each night to find him quietly reading, or simply staring out the window as though still unsure he was truly outside. He moved gently, cautiously, like every step had to be earned. She watched him with a heaviness she never spoke aloud, not because she pitied him, but because she recognized the shape of his grief. It mirrored her own, just bent in a different direction. Some nights, she'd find herself standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at him and wondering how many versions of him had been lost over those 9 years. He never told her everything. She never asked. But in the way he hesitated before entering rooms, or flinched at sudden noises, the story told itself in fragments. There was a morning, soft with rain and the smell of bread baking downstairs, when he finally spoke more than a few sentences at once. He had taken one of her mugs, the blue one with the crack on the side, and sat near the window with his hands wrapped around it like something fragile. She was on the other side of the room, organizing a file she hadn't even meant to open. He looked at her without turning his head fully. His voice was low, almost hollow, like something unused too long. He said he didn't remember what it was like to choose. Not just big things, like what city to live in or what job to take, but small ones. When to eat, what to wear, whether to speak. In prison, decisions were made for you before you even realized you wanted to make them. He said the scariest thing now wasn't the noise of the world or the people who had forgotten him. It was the weight of choice returning like a stranger knocking on his door. She didn't interrupt. She didn't reassure him with empty words. Instead, she walked to the cabinet, took out another mug, filled it, and placed it next to his without a sound. He looked at it, then at her, and something softened behind his eyes. That was how they communicated now, not in grand confessions, but in gestures stitched from old threads of trust. He never said thank you. She never needed him to. He stayed in the apartment, slowly reclaiming pieces of himself, and she carried on with her cases, never once mentioning the shadow of their shared past, unless he did first. Months passed. Seasons shifted. He began to take short walks alone, first just down the street, then to the bookstore 2 blocks over. He returned each time with a new title and a look of quiet satisfaction. He applied for a library card. Eventually, he took a part-time job repairing shelves at a second-hand shop where no one asked questions he couldn't answer. Ella watched all of it from a distance that didn't isolate him, but respected the boundaries he was only just learning to draw. They began to move more naturally around each other, their routines tangling like vines growing toward the same patch of sun. They talked more in the evenings, about her work, about his plans, about books, about how strange it felt to laugh again. And slowly, they began to remember how to be near each other without the ache of everything they had endured pressing between them. There was no dramatic turning point, no kiss under a rain-soaked sky. It was quieter than that, like a door left open on a spring morning, letting in a breeze neither of them noticed until it warmed the room. One night, while washing dishes, he reached for a plate she was drying, their fingers brushing without ceremony. She didn't pull away. He didn't either. They stood like that for a long moment, and when he finally looked at her, he said her name in a way he hadn't in years. Soft. Certain. She smiled, not because it was romantic, but because it was real. That night, he didn't return to the couch. He didn't ask. She didn't invite. He simply walked into the room, laid beside her, and they both fell asleep without speaking. Their wedding was as quiet as the lives they had rebuilt. No white aisle, no crowd, no speeches, just a courthouse, 2 signatures, and a vow spoken in a voice that didn't need to be loud to carry truth. They didn't dress up. She wore a pale blouse and black slacks. He wore a jacket a size too big, but when the judge asked if they promised to stay by each other's side, they didn't hesitate. Not because they were clinging to some fairy tale of redemption, but because they had already lived through the worst parts, and they still chose each other. Afterward, they went to a small cafe where the owner knew Ella by name, and brought them pie without being asked. They sat by the window, watching people pass by, the world indifferent to their story. And maybe that was the beauty of it, that they didn't need the world to witness their healing to make it real. Ella still walked with her old limp, and he still startled at sudden sounds, but they carried those scars without shame. In time, they moved to a quieter town. She opened a modest legal practice, specializing in wrongful convictions and criminal appeals. He worked at a bookstore, greeting customers with a calm that came from surviving the storm. They never spoke of the day he was taken, or the day she saw him again across the glass. Not because it didn't matter, but because it had already shaped every part of who they were. They had found peace not in forgetting, but in enduring. And in each other, they had found a place to finally rest. Beloved, this story isn't just a tale, it's a mirror. It shows us that people will mock what they don't understand, fear what they can't control, and sometimes destroy what they secretly admire. But no matter how cruel the world becomes, your strength doesn't have to shout. It just has to endure. Let Ella's journey remind you, you are not your flaw, your limp, your past, or your pain. You are your fight. You are your fire. You are your truth. And like Alex, never stop hoping. Even if the world walks away, even if you're buried by lies, truth has feet, and one day it walks back into the room and clears your name. You may feel alone, betrayed, or forgotten, but hold on. God is not blind, and justice delayed is never justice denied when he's involved. So if life has framed you wrongly, if the people you love turned on you, or if your strength is stretched thin, don't give up. You're not done yet. You are rising. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.